Hello students, in our last video we did an introduction to Biographia Literaria written by Coleridge. Today we will take up genesis of Wordsworth's theories and Coleridge's reaction to it. Wordsworth and Coleridge came together in early life. It was in 1796 that they were frequently together, and out of their mutual discussion arose the various theories which Wordsworth embodied in his preface to the lyrical ballads, which he tried to put into practice in his poems also. Coleridge claimed credit for these theories and said that they were half the child of his brain, but later on his views underwent a change and he no longer agreed with Wordsworth's theories, and so he criticized them in chapter 17 and chapter 18 of Biographia Literaria. Coleridge's criticism is the last word on this subject. It has been improved upon up to date. Choice of rustic themes and the reasons which Wordsworth gave for this theory. Wordsworth in his lyrical ballads says that they have been objects of Coleridge's censure. First of all, Wordsworth writes that he chose low and rustic life because in that condition the essential passions of human heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, and they are less under restraint. They speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Secondly, he gives the reason for choosing rustic theme, that in such condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated. The third reason he says is that manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupations are more easily comprehended and more durable. And lastly, he says that condition, the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent objects of nature. So he chooses rustic themes. Now the second point which he gives is choice of rustic language. He says that the language too of these men is adopted, although it is purified indeed from what appear to be its real defects, from all lasting and rational causes of dislike or disgust, because such men early communicate with the best objects from which the best part of the language is originally derived, and because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse being less under the action of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. Coming to the next point, which says that language of prose and poetry, there is no essential difference. He made a number of statements regarding the language and diction of poetry. Of these, Coleridge controverts the following parts: a selection of the real language of man, the language of these men, that is, men in low and rustic life, Wordsworth proposes to imitate and, as far as possible, to adopt the very language of men, and between the language of prose and that of metrical composition, there neither is nor can be any essential difference. Coleridge disagrees with all these 3 points, and he criticizes the first one, that is, the themes of poetry, in the following manner. As regards the first statement, that is, the choice of rustic characters and life, Coleridge points out that not all of Wordsworth's characters are chosen from low or rustic life. Characters in poems like Ruth, Michael, the brothers are not low and rustic in the usual acceptance of these words. Secondly, their language and sentiments do not necessarily arise from their abode or occupation. They are attributable to causes which would result in similar sentiments and language even if these characters were living in a different place and carrying on different occupation. These causes are primarily two. First one, independence, which raises a man above servility, and frugal life and industrious domestic life, and a solid religious education which makes a man well versed in Bible and other holy books to the exclusion of other books. The admirable qualities we notice in the language and sentiments of Wordsworth's characters result from these two causes and not from their rural life and occupation or their contemplation of nature. Even if they lived in the city away from the nature, they would have similar sentiments and similar language if they were subject to the two causes mentioned by Wordsworth. In the opinion of Coleridge, a man will not be benefited from a life in rural solitudes unless he has a natural sensibility and a suitable education. In the absence of these two advantages, in rural conditions, the mind hardens and a man grows selfish, sensual, gross, and hard-hearted. As regards the second point, that is the choice of rustic language, Coleridge objects to the view that the best part of the language is derived from the objects with which the rustic hourly communicates. First, communication with an object implies reflection on it, and the richness of vocabulary arises from such reflections. Now, the rural conditions of life do not require any reflection. Hence, the vocabulary of the rustics is poor. They can express only the barest facts of nature and not the ideas and thoughts, universal laws which result from reflection on such facts. Secondly, the best part of man's language does not result merely from communication with nature but from education and from the mind's dwelling on noble thoughts. On the third point, that is the language of prose and poetry, Coleridge says that every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activity of his faculties, and as a result, the depth or quickness of his feelings. Every man's language has first its individual peculiarities, and secondly, the properties common to the class to which he belongs, and thirdly, words and phrases of universal use. No two men of the same class or of different classes speak alike, although both use words and phrases common to them all, because in the one case their natures are different and in other case their classes are different. This applies as much to the language of rustics as to that of townsmen. In both cases, the language varies from person to person, class to class, place to place. To Wordsworth's contention that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry, Coleridge replies that there is and there should be an essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. The language of poetry differs from that of prose in the same way in which the language of prose differs and ought to differ from the language of conversation. As regards that, reading is different from talking. Coleridge gives a number of reasons in support of his view. First, language is both a matter of words and the arrangement of these words. Now, words both in prose and poetry may be the same, but their arrangement is totally different. This difference arises from the fact that the poetry uses meter and meter requires a different arrangement of words. So, coming to the conclusion, we can see that Coleridge refutes Wordsworth's views on the themes and language of poetry.